Hello, my name is Rob Crandall. If you don't know me, I'm the Assistant State Materials Engineer in the Materials Division, and I'm going to take a few minutes to go over specification changes that the Materials Division has worked with industry to talk about and agree upon for our contracts for the calendar 2021 paving season. Before we get into the specs, I'm going to take a slide out of our old material certification schools and give everybody a little primer review of our hierarchy of documents and contract provisions. I apologize if this is something you know and understand and have it by heart. I don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence, but I think this is a good review even for folks who have it under your hat. But for those of you that maybe are newer to our contracts or maybe just haven't this before, this is a really good thing to understand before we talk about specs. This is a slide we use very early in our material certification schools. And the hierarchy of these with this slide is from left to right, the lowest to highest. We start with standard drawings. Anything that's a standard drawing in our specs, or I shouldn't say specs, I should say our book of standards. Those are the foundation standards that you would reference for how things should be built, designed and built. We then move to specifications. If there's anything about anything that we're going to design or build, we typically write standard specifications, and that applies to everything that specification covers. You then move to the right and you get to terms maybe that aren't as clear. Supplemental specifications, what are those? Well, you know, we issue standard specifications every few years. I think in a perfect world we do it every year, but it just isn't viable. It probably isn't necessary sometimes to think about issuing a spec book every year or new standard specs every year. So if we put out a standard specification book, road and bridge spec book in 2020, you know, practically speaking, it's dated the minute it's printed. Because things change for good reasons. Sometimes maybe you think bad reasons, but things change. And when we make those changes, we don't collect all those books back up, or in today's world, collect all the links back up and put it back out. What we do is we issue supplemental specifications, and that becomes the active specification for that portion of our road and bridge specs until the standard specs can be updated altogether. So you can see how supplemental specs would trump standard specs because they're more recent. And that is the official contractually legal hierarchy between those two. When I teach this class, I talk about, you know, as a young engineer, I would look at a spec and I would see something maybe in the field that I didn't think was being followed, and I'd wave my spec book around if I was challenged, say, well, you know, the spec book says X, Y, Z, but you know, sometimes I was wrong because in the contract there was a supplemental specification reference, or maybe as I go further, there's a special provision or special provision copy note, which I'll talk about in the contract itself, that had a higher or hierarchy in that contract. That's why it's so important to read every single contract. And so I fell victim to that, and we talk about it in the MCS schools that way. The next step in the hierarchy is plans, your plan sheets. On our paving contracts, like we'll talk about today, we typically don't have plans. In fact, a lot of the contracts themselves are called no plan contracts with no plan assemblies at the back of them for that reason. But if you're on a contract with plans, anything written on the plans would trump any of those prior three: standard drawings, standard specs, or supplemental specs. Then we get into the most specific things about VDOT contract language. Special provisions, which tend to be, just like they say, provisions, contract provisions that are special for this contract, or maybe a group or type of contracts that need to be different than the standard or supplemental spec that cover everything. Those are things that I'll talk about a little later. We do use when we need to select them to use on an individual project because it has a special need, or a group of projects that operate a certain way. So you hear us talk about special provisions. They're special to that contract or group of contracts. And then the last and highest hierarchy is special provision copied notes. Those are just, again, what they sound like. In a contract, there will be a note or copied note, tend to be very short, a few sentences, that would trump and override any other things to include a special provision. Most of the time, those are things where you're removing just a small piece or adding a small piece of information that you need to have in your contract and enforce and apply. So I apologize for taking that much time, but I think that's a good primer. You'll be happy to know the rest of this won't take very long. The good news about that is I'm talking about spec changes, and we just don't have that many. That's not by accident. That's something that we have been making a conscious effort to not have spec changes. It's not that we don't have things we want to work on and make better. We are. Many of you have heard of balanced mix design. We're putting a whole lot of work into a whole new way of designing and testing asphalt mixes, but that's out a little ways until at least initial implementation in 2023. And in the meantime, we're not looking to change a whole lot. So I do want to talk about a couple of things we did decide to change for 2021. The biggest one is VDOT saw, and industry agreed with our perspective, that we wanted to try and clarify density testing language and where incentives for density could and should be applied and be eligible, and where they shouldn't. And we thought we wanted to take a shot at clarifying that. I think we've done it. We'll see during the year, but I'll talk about what that is here in a minute. And then the industry very specifically asked us to look at pulling as many special provisions. You know, we talked about special provisions in my last slide, into standard or supplemental specs. We had as many as 19 different special provisions for Section 315, with your asphalt placement, and special provision 211s. We had a whole bunch as well. 211 is for asphalt mix design specs, and sometimes the special provisions are, you know, they're there for a reason and need to be, but sometimes they proliferate and we need to pull them back in. And so that's what we've worked on, is to see where we can pull them back in, where it makes sense to do that, and where it doesn't, we need to leave them as special provisions. So let's talk about that. List of special provisions for 211 and 315s and what we've looked to do with them. Almost all of this really isn't, again, about content change. It's just about reorganization. Density determination and where there are bonuses, we moved that into the supplemental 315. Remember, I said supplemental is really the new standard spec. We just haven't created a new spec book yet. So that's the latest 315 that you should be using, unless there's a special provision or special provision copy note that trumps it. SM 4.75 had been a special provision because it's the mix that we hadn't had or used before, but we've gone ahead and moved it into supplemental 211 and 315, one for mix design, one for placement of that mix. Trench widening T mixes, we actually created a new section, new chapter, I should say, of supplemental section 321. Base BM25D and high modulus high bonder base, we moved into 211 and 315 supplementals as well. Then you'll see a whole bunch. What is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different special provisions that revolve around sealing cracks, scratch and leveling courses, surface prep, overlay, limits of mainline overlays, those sort of things. We combined all of those 5 into supplemental 322. Shoulder wedge, we decided to leave that as a special provision at this time. The MACO is going into its own section 319. We did have to make a revision to section 210 about the tackle requirement for Tobacco as well. But you look for Tobacco no longer as a special provision, but in 319, its own section. 3 different patching special provisions were combined into a new 323 supplemental, and then these last 5, saw and seal asphalt overlay over jointed concrete, 3 pavement recycling, CCPR, CIR, and FDR placement, and the rideability specs all stay as special provisions. I believe this is my last slide, next to last slide. I wanted to read to you the actual meat of the change in language that we hope is going to clarify where bonuses are eligible for density when density bonuses are in your contract. We get lots of questions or lots of opinions about interpretations of, well, you know, shoulders should be eligible. I should be getting paid for bonus on shoulders, or no, we shouldn't. Or what about a crossover? Or what about a gore area? What about those things? We wanted to clear that up, and I'll tell you, it sounds easy, but when you start to try and write this stuff, it's really not as easy as all that, because you start to think of all the different scenarios. Now, different people have different opinions about where we should or not, but we have to make decisions on that to write the spec. So I'm going to read this to you so everybody hopefully gets it. We're going to define mainline pavement when we're talking about paying bonuses. Mainline pavement is defined to include travel lanes. Everybody gets travel lanes, right? Travel lanes, shoulders 6 feet or greater, turn lanes, ramps, and acceleration, deceleration lanes. Any pay adjustment will be applied to mainline pavement. So when we're talking about density bonus, density bonuses will be eligible to be paid on mainline pavement. Density testing for acceptance will not be performed on open graded friction courses, variable thickness overbuild courses, leveling courses, miscellaneous asphalt pavement, crossovers, or gore areas. So those are out. You're not going to test for density. You're not going to be eligible for a density bonus on there. Now, there are other situations, small quantities, and other situations where the specs and special provisions do speak to how they're paid for, but it's mainline pavement that is eligible for density. We hope that goes a long way to clearing up any misinterpretation or misunderstanding between VDOT and industry about where that density bonus can and should be eligible for pavement. And just wanted to highlight that we're moving both method A and B language where the incentive was created 4 or 5 years ago into that supplemental section 315 starting in 2021. And what that means is before it was a special provision that had only been applied to maintenance contracts. As you go into supplemental and it applies to everything now, it's going to be both maintenance and construction jobs. So for your VDOTers and you contractors, that incentive language is now eligible on construction work as well. So that's a great opportunity for us as VDOT to get better density and see our pavements last longer on construction projects as well. And for you contractors, if you can give us that quality, a great opportunity to realize a bonus. That's a win-win whenever we're paying that bonus for VDOT. So I want to thank you for your time. I hope that first slide wasn't too painful. And I look forward to any questions or conversation we have at the end. Again, thank you for your time. Take care.